Son estudiantes del doctorado, coméntale, please, para que un poco vea la audiencia más directa.
Yes, Jussi, we have some doctorate students with us.
Son estudiantes del doctorado, coméntale, please.
Fantastic.
Un poco vea la audiencia más directa.
Sí, so
Exacto.
we have some doctorate students with us.
Son estudiantes del doctorado, coméntale.
Great. Nice to meet you, everyone. Really nice to be in the same Zoom space, at least, with everyone. Thank you.
Muy bien.
Okay. So now we are live on YouTube.
Got it. Shall we wait a bit before we start? And whoever, yeah.
Esperamos un poquito antes de empezar, Carlos.
Sí, yo creo que ya. Sí, yo voy a partir, yo creo ya.
We are about to start, you
Sí.
see.
Okay. Yeah, anytime. Let me know then.
Okay. So Carlos will introduce you in Spanish and I will introduce you in English. Okay.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Muy bien. Creo que no hay más en lista de espera. Bien, pues se escucha, creo que bien, ¿no? Damos primero un saludo a todas y todos quienes están en este minuto con nosotros aquí, que nos acompañan en esta actividad que ha sido organizada por el Doctorado en Comunicación, conjunto entre la Universidad de la Frontera y la Universidad Austral de Chile. Agradecemos obviamente al doctor Jussi Parikka por su disposición para acompañarnos hoy con su conferencia, que es la arqueología mediática, 10 años después. El doctor Jussi Parikka es profesor en estética y cultura digital de la Universidad de Aarhus, Dinamarca, profesor visitante en la Academia de Artes Escénicas de Praga, República Checa, y profesor visitante de la Escuela de Arte Winchester de la Universidad de Southampton, Reino Unido. Fue docente de teoría de la cultura digital en la Universidad de Turku, su alma mater en Finlandia, en la cual se doctoró en historia cultural. Parikka ha escrito sobre arqueología mediática, arte mediático contemporáneo, cultura de red y teoría cultural. Entre sus publicaciones más recientes podemos encontrar una geología de los medios, publicado en el 2021 por Caja Negra, Buenos Aires, publicado en inglés en el 2015, Antropoceno y otros ensayos, medios, materialidad y ecología, publicado en Santiago de Chile en el 2021 por Ediciones Mímesis, Arqueología mediática desde la naturaleza, publicado en el 2016, junto a Tony Sampson, Arqueología mediática desde la naturaleza, entrevista a Jussi Parikka, entrevista de Paul Feyerfeld, 2015, que es la arqueología mediática, publicado en el 2012, Arqueología mediática, el 2011, junto a Erkki Juntamo, Medios de insectos, una arqueología de los animales y la tecnología, publicado en el 2010, Contagios digitales, publicado en el 2007, entre otras obras. Obtuvo el premio Anne Friedberg a la investigación innovadora con su obra ¿Qué es la arqueología mediática?, el 2012. Vamos a escuchar entonces al doctor Jussi Parikka, quien va a hacer su presentación, naturalmente en inglés. Vamos a ir presentando una traducción conforme él va hablando, ¿cierto? Vamos a tener hay una pantalla, como si fuera un invitado, digamos, donde va a estar la traducción. Es importante que ustedes puedan verla, digamos, conforme lo estimen, porque, claro, cuando esté hablando el doctor Parikka, se va a ver probablemente más bien su presentación también en la pantalla, entonces para que sepan que ahí pueden ir leyendo en esa ventana, ¿no? Una vez que el doctor Parikka termine su presentación, tendremos el tiempo para las preguntas. Y en este sentido, lo único que les queremos pedir es que puedan hacer sus preguntas a través del chat, ya sea a través del chat de Zoom, donde están, o el chat de YouTube, quienes estén por esa vía, ¿no? Si alguien quisiera hacer alguna pregunta también directa al doctor Parikka, ahí solo solicitaremos que lo haga directamente en inglés, digamos, y tenga la conversación con él, y luego Rubén, el doctor Rubén Sánchez, que me acompaña aquí, que va a hacer todo ese proceso de traducción de las preguntas, digamos, también pueda comentar, ¿no? Así es que muchas gracias, doctor Parikka, y le escuchamos atentamente.
Bien, también, bueno, añadir a esto que se pueden hacer también preguntas en español a través de YouTube y a través del chat aquí en Zoom. Así que ahí estaré también pendiente para poder transmitir estas preguntas. Como muy bien decía Carlos, hay una ventana que se llama CM Traducción, una pantallita, ¿verdad? Ahí se va a proyectar la traducción, y para aquel que quiera verlo en grande, si uno pone el cursor encima de CM Traducción, verá que arriba a la derecha aparece un botón azul. Ahí se puede presionar y en ese botón uno puede escoger la segunda opción. Yo tengo el zoom en inglés que pone PIN, no sé cómo lo dice en castellano, pero es una cosa que permite mantener esa pantalla en grande sin importar quién hable, y siempre uno verá esa pantalla, ¿de acuerdo? El doctor Parikka también va a proyectar una presentación suya, así que aquellos pues que ya sepan inglés o puedan oír el inglés bien y entenderlo, pues no hace falta que vean la traducción y podrán ver también su presentación, ¿de acuerdo? Bien, pues ahora voy a presentar al doctor Parikka en inglés y enseguida le damos la palabra. Well, greetings to the students and teachers who accompany us in this activity organized by the Joint Doctorate in Communication offered by la Universidad de la Frontera and la Universidad Austral de Chile. We thank Dr. Jussi Parikka for his generous willingness to join us today with the presentation, What is Media Archaeology 10 Years Later? I have to say that this is not something that Carlos said, but I have to say that the first time I heard the name of Jussi Parikka was some months ago, while one of our students, who is here with us today, Mauro, cited his work. And then a couple of weeks later, I was reading this book called Atlas of AI. And then in that book, Jussi Parikka's work was cited again. And I was like, oh, I heard this name before. And now I have the pleasure to meet him online. So this was very good and very fun for me. Thank you for being with us. I would like to continue saying what Carlos said as well. Dr. Jussi Parikka is professor of aesthetics and digital culture at Aarhus University, Denmark, visiting professor at the Academy of Performing Arts in Prague, Czech Republic, and visiting professor at the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. He taught digital culture theory at the University of Turku, his alma mater in Finland, from which he received his doctorate in cultural history. Parikka has written on media archaeology, contemporary media art, network culture, and cultural theory. Among his most recent publications, we find two publications that have been recently translated into Spanish and that Carlos mentioned. One is The Geology of Media, published by Caja Negra in Buenos Aires in 2021, and The Anthropocene and Other Essays, Media, Materiality, and Ecology, this one published in Santiago de Chile in 2021. Other works are Media Archaeology from Nature, published in 2016, Media Archaeology from Nature, interview with Jussi Parikka by Paul Feigerfeld, and as well Media Archaeology in 2011 with Eriki Hutamo. Another work is Insect Media, an Archaeology of Animals and Technology in 2010, and as well Digital Contagions, a Media Archaeology of Computer Viruses that was published in 2007. His most cited work, according to Google Scholar, is What is Media Archaeology, published in 2013. Because of this book, Dr. Parikka won the Anne Friedberg Award for Innovative Research. This is the work that gives the title to today's presentation. Once Dr. Parikka finishes his presentation, we will have time for questions please write them in the chat, either on Zoom or YouTube. Thank you very much, Dr. Parikka, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me well. I'm going to share my screen, but also, as already mentioned, you can pin the translation up on your screen, so you can select which one you want to follow. Big thanks, Ruben, and big thanks, Carlos. Thank you very much, Carlos, for being in touch for several months now. And we've had wonderful dialogue on email and including this really wonderful invite. I'm grateful to be able to speak with you all, and sort of even if the task is slightly difficult, perhaps I need to blame myself of giving myself this title of trying to address media archaeology 10 years after, which I don't know, this is not going to be any comprehensive reflection on everything that happened in media archaeology as a field, let alone in other parts of media studies over the past 10 years or so, but I will be slightly biased on some of the things I've been doing as well, but this is not some kind of a self-congratulatory thing where I'm saying that this is the most important things. I'm more just biased because I'm sort of, this is my prism through which I'm seeing things. More recently, and I'll go into my talk soon as well, I'll try to talk approximately half an hour, and most of it is translated on one of the screens. So hopefully that will be also helpful. At the moment, I'm working, as said, in Denmark, but also I've got two projects that sort of have taken me different directions than media archaeology. One is on operational images, this concept by filmmaker Harun Farocki from 20 years back already. This is a big project that I was leading in Prague that ends this year, and the book is coming out probably any week now. And then I'm leading a different project that doesn't feature the word archaeology or media archaeology in its title, but it's on design and aesthetics of and for environmental data here at Aarhus University. That nice logo on the right is designed by my long-term collaborator, Abelardo Gil-Fournier from Madrid, whose work I'll mention a bit later. But also, as mentioned, some of these questions about climate crisis, environment, and their relations with media studies and media theory and the broader humanities theory is really what has been close to my work for several years now. So some of the things that I'll end up today will put us into that ballpark of that context of discussions as such as well. I've got, let's see where I'm with the slides before I start. So hopefully there will be also, like, I'll make some kind of a nice narrative, even if this might otherwise be lots of details and half-baked thoughts and propositions as well, but perhaps it's a nice way of entering into dialogue with you all.
Dr. Parikka, let me summarize a little bit in Spanish.
Right, okay, sure.
Yes. Bueno, está muy contento, el doctor Parikka dice que estoy muy contento de estar aquí con ustedes. Gracias, Carlos, por estar en contacto durante estos meses. Tiene muchas ganas de compartir con nosotros su actividad. La charla de hoy, obviamente, pues tiene que ver con su primera obra, pero no va a ser ni mucho menos algo muy completo, sino que se va a fijar en algunas cosas, en algunos pensamientos. Quiere hablar durante media hora y espera que esto sirva para poder empezar tener una conversación con todos nosotros. Ahora mismo están dos otros proyectos que pronto van a salir adelante. Por lo que he entendido yo, uno tiene que ver con imágenes operacionales y otro tiene que ver con el diseño estético de los datos medioambientales. Bien, esto sería más o menos un resumen. Le devuelvo la palabra al Dr. Parikka. Please, Dr. Parikka, go ahead.
Yes. So let's go to this slide and let's go with the script as well. So around 2012, one part of my research into media archaeology came to a temporary conclusion. The book, What is Media Archaeology, represented one summary of what I saw as the key parameters of this broad field. Yet I was constantly emphasizing that this was already then only a temporary summary. There would be a multitude of other stories, histories, and theoretical emphases that could be written and told. Mine was not the conclusive one, of course. In 2011, we had already published our joint edited book, as mentioned by Carlos and Ruben, book with Huhtamo on media archaeology approaches, applications, and implications that gathered a range of key writers across different fields, from film studies to new media studies, both artists and academicians. It provided an early take on the range of approaches and themes that indeed populated the field of media archaeology since the early 2000s. Also, that was a temporary archaeology of media archaeology, itself a fragment, but not fragment as self-imposed limitation or romanticization, like we often still do, but a reflection on the way of historical knowledge and knowledge formations had been thought at least since 1980s, and new historicism, which had been a key influence to media archaeology, as well as the sort of methodologies that across the humanities of reading through fragments that we recognize from the work of Walter Benjamin to Michel Foucault and many others. Total systems of knowledge seemed impossible and undesirable. So why should we try to have one either? Before our work, many others had appeared and had many had defined and articulated media archaeology again in a range of fields, some more clearly, some less, preferring to do media archaeology instead of defining it. This was also fine. After all, the field and its methods were at least partly invented by artists who, through installations, sound and audiovisual works, less by writing theory, but by way of practice, as well as process-based methods, had investigated what it meant to turn to seemingly obsolete media in the midst of burgeoning newness of internet and digital culture. So the likes of Paul de Marinis, Zoe Beloff, and many others, and later on my collaborator Garnet Hertz, or for instance, the wonderful sound artist Ora Satz, working media archaeologies of sound, as well as other topics often related to, for instance, gender histories of media. Similarly, Anne Friedberg, Marion Doan, Jonathan Crary, Friedrich Kittler, even Paul Virilio seemed media and humanities scholars who were doing this thing without the term archaeology necessarily being used. So while I want to talk about 10 years after, we could ask the question in two directions. What was 10 years before, 20 years before, 30 years before, 100 years before, in a longer term historical commitment to some that is so familiar to media archaeology, to write an intellectual history of this particular field that we know, in many ways in the same spirit as Walter Benjamin's ruins and fragments, but not necessarily also anymore the main reference point, considering the range of other tasks we have at hand and other political questions we have at hand, something that I will end up today as well. Mostly this has to do with colonial context of knowledge, decolonizing certain knowledge formations, as well as, importantly, questions of climate and environment as horizon against which a lot of humanities works. We have already many excellent and detailed works that we can turn to for an archaeology of an archaeology as a mode of thinking. I can warmly recommend Knut Eberling's, let me see if I got it on slides, yes, Knut Eberling's own wild take on matters called Wild Archaeologies, a massive 2-volume book on the wandering notion of archaeology beyond archaeology as a discipline. In other words, from Immanuel Kant to Sigmund Freud, Michel Foucault, Friedrich Kittler, I want to point out a very male and very central European history, and of course needs to be criticized. Similarly, Thomas Elsasser's wonderful self-reflections and summaries, as well as critical points in his take on media archaeology, are very useful. These include also his 2016 archaeology article on media archaeology as a symptom, not necessarily as a solution. Elsasser argues that media archaeology flourished as a function of the discourses of digital media, with 2 points especially intriguing. That media archaeology also continued what, in Elsasser's words, was our culture's most prominent pathology. In his words, the pathology of needing to preserve the past, to fetishize memory and materiality in the form of trauma and loss, even as we lose faith in history and make our lives every more dependent on the virtual. Provocation from Elsasser. And secondly, that in cherishing every possible earlier forgotten trait, this is what media archaeology so often does, this idea of forgotten, looking at forgotten paths. It might be easily adapted by the industry of nostalgia, whether that of contemporary art as a particular form of production of nostalgia through all kinds of retro enthusiasm for the retro, or these values of quirky inventions and as vintage and retro. I want to emphasize a couple of things. One helps to situate some of the context of media archaeology, and to insist that there is also a more specified task that must resist nostalgization, if that is even a word, nostalgia in general, or the production of nostalgia, and focus on some other aspects of knowledge production through this minority position. I want to talk through a couple of things now then in this talk. Firstly, to follow up on a couple of points from summary of what is media archaeology, the book from approximately 2012, namely these 3 coordinates that are the conclusions of the book, defining through these a particular methodology, but also an attitude, epistemic atmosphere, and even an activity, very different sort of axis of active methodological activity. And there would be a lot longer story about how to think of methods in these terms. Anyway, firstly, on doing, the fact that media archaeology is practiced already by the sheer number of artists, but also designers who practice media archaeology, and a couple of points that I will return to very soon about practice of media archaeology. Then on temporality, the idea that it is premised on the idea that there are multiplicity of temporalities that are not just histories. They are all kinds of ways of thinking about other times that might resonate also with political agendas, politically important knowledge agendas like decolonial thinking. And then thirdly, on matter, questions of materiality and how we reframe our methodologies to also include materiality of media and culture. And the ways in which this resonates with a lot of media theory, but also practices with these seemingly immaterial areas of investigation like software or digital culture and signal processing, and other technical and non-technical realities of media. Now, I have to admit, and as mentioned again, big thank you for mentioning this already, Carlos, as well. In a way, a lot of my work over the past 7 years or so hasn't touched on media archaeology so much. Even my book, Geology of Media with Ka Negra, is on the one hand emerging from media archaeology, but it's not just a media archaeology book. It's a book about environmental media and humanities. But I still, of course, want to reflect on these themes and find these common traits that connect to earlier media archaeological work. And of course, anyone who has seen their wonderful, thank you to, again, publishers, huge work, they are beautiful editions, who's seen the book by Mimesis, published in Santiago de Chile. It includes, of course, work that has resonance with media archaeology, including my work on remains and questions of memory and time and so forth. So I'm slightly, of course, contradicting myself, and this is an absolutely horrible slide. So please do not feel anxious that you would have to read it. I just wanted to put it up there because I'm occasionally accused of not giving a simple definition of media archaeology. But I want to ask, would that even be possible? Because there is no single media archaeology, and it would miss the point about its multiple beginnings and the multiplicity of the field to try to give one definition. And yet I try to do this. This is written around the time when the book came out, about 10, 13 years ago, as what I coined the beta definition of media archaeology, not full definition, again, 0.9 definition. And it's very long and cumbersome, but hopefully it will resonate with a couple of points that I want to make. I won't read it, and I'll leave it there because I'll just talk about a couple of points that I emphasize there as well. Let me just pick a couple of phrases, and anyone who wants to look at it, there's the link as well. Firstly, media archaeology is heterogeneous set of theories and methods. It reflects a lot about the sort of humanities theories that were born in the 70s and especially 1980s as well, that moved across disciplines. Not only media archaeology, of course, but more bigger and significant fields like media studies, gender and queer studies, post-colonial studies, later on decolonial studies, are not only defined by what discipline they are, but in how they reformulate disciplines and their methods and build new objects of knowledge that move in between disciplines. Media archaeology works with similar ideas as well, or similar pattern, with a similar spirit of traveling concepts, and this notion of traveling I will return to soon. And then it's about time. It's about time and history, and time and history and theory as well. Much of the work is methodologically about history and archival work to look at alternative paths of ignored trajectories. But this work is done not just as a historian's work, but with an explicit or implicit theory of time that is alternative to history, as we understand history as often linear written story from beginning to an end. Instead, there are notions like deep time, recursive time, microtemporality are some of the terms that feature in these methods. As per many of the theoretical critics, such as Friedrich Kittler, the technical basis of recording of time, sound recording, for instance, cinema as a technology of time and so forth, had moved on from the mode of human writing, human history to something else, also pointed out by people like Wolfgang Ernst. And also there's a wonderful point that I forgot to write on the slides, but it's in the translation, I believe, point from Knut Ebeling, that archaeology fundamentally differs from history. In archaeology, one does not count from the beginning to the end. One calculates back from the end, which is the present. So speaking of counting and calculating, if we stick with this long passage, there are materialities that are not necessarily automatically human interpretable. They're not necessarily about human interpretable narrative formats of texts. One reads technical media in a different way than one reads a book, to state it simply. This then is also central to many other fields that emerge in the past decades where we share the field. Software studies, who are people there who are keen to find specific methods that do not just import early assumptions about cultural texts, but they really need to think about what kind of not even a text is software. And then other forms of digital culture studies as well. And then the last passage in this long discussion, we could talk about the whole text, this one page of text. I want this half a page of text forever, but I'm jumping into the last point about place and space, that it takes place in labs and laboratories and so forth. As it is a context of doing, a praxis, that this was hint of already something that came out then later on that I started being really interested in. Part of collaborative work that really was released just last year Our lab book continued this thread about spaces of media archaeology, but also media theory in general, media studies and humanities, by asking the question about labs. I don't know about Chile, but also I'm guessing that the same trend might have gone through and might have already passed away as well. Went through with different, time frames. But basically the question, why are there so many labs in the past years across academic universities and non-academic places? And not all of them are part of the legacy of the corporate MIT Media Lab, but also other forms of examples, other forms of practices, including the centrality of so-called media archaeology labs, such as my colleague Laurie Emerson's work in the US at Boulder, Colorado, or Darren Welshler's residual media depot in Montreal in Canada, that at least despite it not having the media archaeology in its title, carries, at least in spirit, the emphasis on media archaeological practices of residuals, but also, for example, practices such as circuit bending, of how to methodologically think about game, as in digital and console electronic game cultures as well. Now, this notion of space would be really interesting, and in a way the next point also relates to space, and I've got a typo there. It should be Mikebal and not Mikebar. Perhaps it was software which auto-corrected. As part of this sort of interest in space, but also movement, and the ways in which space and movement are part of the ways in which theory works as well. As for tropes of movement and themes that I want to continue now, I am very in debt to the notion of traveling, with a hat tip to Mika Ball, who speaks of traveling concepts that glue different disciplines together. Her early 2000 book of the same name, Traveling Concepts, is really wonderful, and it was extremely inspiring to me when I was doing my PhD, because it was an alternative way of doing cultural analysis and very much practiced in the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis. And and also how these traveling notions, whether we notice their powers or not, they are there as central parts of how different disciplines are actually in interaction. Even these sort of a very mundane concepts like author, or more recent terms, or well, it has a long history, but decolonial, they travel and they carry with them conceptual, historical, but also affective forces, and there's something that glue different aspects of humanities, for instance, together. And of course, hat tip to also Edward Said for the notion of traveling theory. In a short reflection on traveling, let me start with a simple point that itself links with the questions of situations of theory, situations of media archaeology as a vector, not a point. The idea of a primacy of movement, how it is rolled out both as disciplinary formation, change in the impact and meaning of theoretical concepts, that they're not just rehearsed in the place of their origin, as well as in the political context of the use of traveling. What does that mean in this current day of 2023? Media archaeology, like other disciplines and like other theories and like other concepts, it travels. That is one of the guiding ideas of what is media archaeology, and it is articulated in the transformation of concepts, fields, and sometimes disciplines. Ideas take place in institutional context, in offices like the one I'm sitting now, but also in exchanges, in discourses, in suitcases, emails, and in this case, suitcases that carry notes, books, random pieces of paper and notes, other media of thinking. Ideas and concepts take flight as emails and packages of books that are sent across borders. They take place in reading groups that open up, resituate, critique, debate concepts. Of course, we have to be aware that borders are sometimes not easy to cross. Borders and the centrality of migration, movement, and free borders should not be taken lightly or metaphorically, even if it becomes easily a kind of a lighthearted theoretical notion. how to negotiate the two aspects, how to account for mobility and movement of concepts and people. Theoretically, it might be easier. I explain in the introduction of what is media archaeology that the idea of media archaeology as a traveling set of concepts and methods refers to how it was never placed in just one discipline. It traveled between media and cinema studies, art history and art practices, history of technology and history of science. Translations also demonstrate that it travels across languages. This is important for various reasons. The obvious one is that new concepts might introduce new sorts of discussions and become useful in transforming fields in different academic languages. And again, this is where we point a thank you to the translation of this talk as well as essential part of the infrastructure of the talk, the translation and the translation labor. But another point is that they also trigger already bubbling under forms of research, and they sometimes help to give name to practices that are practiced in other contexts of art or research. We often do things we don't have a name for, and this applies to academic work as well. Something like media history, but not quite. Something that is part of media theory, but not only. Something that speaks about cultural history of science and technology, but is practiced by artists as well. All this kind of a slightly fuzziness of what is methodological activity as well. And then, of course, the realization. Media archaeology is at times closer to histories of art and technology than it is to traditional communication studies. Sometimes it exercises philosophical arguments about the nature of time and temporality, and some ideas resonate with work in gender studies. I'm here thinking, for instance, let's see, for some reason my slightly stuck. Here we go. I'm here thinking of Juliana Bruno's wonderful Atlas of Emotion as one example of gender studies, art history, and cinema studies, sharing a common ground, and as a useful reminder that it wasn't only white Central European male theorists who were doing media archaeology, far from it. Media archaeology is then a catalyzer and a conduit for interdisciplinary investigations into the worlds of technology, but in ways that provide alternative methodologies to those of mass media or communication studies. And indeed, to riff with Edward Said in his take on that wonderful short text of traveling theory, in the final words of that article, and what is critical consciousness? At the bottom, if not an unstoppable predilection for alternatives. Now, I want to ask, what sort of alternatives are we after? Let's stick with this idea of alternatives because it's so central to the engine of media archaeology. It's so central to the engine of critical theory that we're always after alternatives, which then begs the question of, well, what kind of an alternative? Even this predilection is loaded with histories of those traveling theories and concepts and their political geohistory. Said himself would be a great example as a Palestinian scholar and activist and based and replaced and deplaced and whatnot. So he definitely knew what he was talking about. The political geohistory of concepts, that they come from places, they travel to places, that theories are vectors, not points. And as such, they also meant to mobilize things at the site of their arrival when they land somewhere. To take into account Thomas Elsasser's warning that romanticization of any alternative whatsoever is not an option, we also need to investigate, though, that what do we mean by alternatives? So at the back of the point about traveling and immigration and migration, what else would come to mind is to think of travels of theory in relation to questions of placement and deplacement, fragility and enforced migration, as well as hostility that we witness across the world at the back of attacks against theory, against critical race theory, such as in the US, but also in many other places as well. and against many other critical theories of our legacy of humanities of past 30, 40 years, as well as the re-emergence of far-right forces that want to set up even stronger borders, but also increasingly are trying to control our university curricula based on their premises of what should and what should not be taught. This broader mess continues the earlier years of theory or method wars, but also involves the multi-scalar forces of ultra-conservatives joining up with neo-fascists and many transnational links as well. So connotations of traveling and migration are not easy metaphors. They're not necessarily these cozy conference visits, but they might be also meant for many people, stressful encounters with border regimes and policing, whether theoretical or actual. Hence, these past years of resurfaced discussion about decoloniality must be also one part of this broader reflection of what such seemingly apolitical discourse as media archaeology is about, as far as it has to think through what this traveling might mean as a way to carve out local contexts where concepts start to build their own archives and meaningful connotations, and where they need to be exposed to already existing histories and needs and political context as well. So a couple of things might happen. Our notion of media might change from the body of naturalized reference points that are usually the standard histories of modernity and media that we already know what we talk about when we talk about media, radio, cinema, television, whatnot. What sort of an alternative framework emerges when processes of urbanization and mediation are not the same? Nor are the sort of frameworks for emergence of newness when we do not even agree on the timeline of what is new and old. Same indeed goes for obsolete, in which terms or what even goes into the more loaded term of waste, as in media waste, electronic waste and such. These temporal notions that have very different connotations in different geographical and geopolitical locations. Again, a theme that has been echoed by many others in critiques of modernity, of course, and proponents of alternative modernity. I want to ask what comes out from these starting points if we start with waste, if we start with obsolescence, if we start from integral waste, which is a Sean Cubitt's term that rearranges use and misuse, labor and exploitation in ways that by necessity asks for a different story, a different starting point, which reads exploitation of human energy as part and parallel to the externalization of ills of energy production, as in fossil fuels, that is taking place as pollution of lands and often indigenous lands. Sean Cubitt's work on integral waste is really wonderful in these ways. This broader task of understanding colonial contexts together with decolonial futures and decolonial histories is then not just an expansion of topics to do more of this or that, but also to further radically look at what are the meaningful starting points for materiality, one that can include also materiality of labor, gendered labor, racialized capitalism, as it enters to something that escapes any pre-given template. Indeed, the sort of references that colleagues have done for decades on references to another alter-modernities, another modernities, is already a field that is much more advanced in these terms and has been for several decades. Also, to follow Divesh Chakrabarty's idea, the provincialization of Europe needs to be central to much of where media archaeology is going. It needs to be part and parcel of the renewal of media archaeology. And I would add a provincialization of the Anglo-North American link, while recognizing the plurality of Europe as well, including the multiple colonial mechanisms that have been, again, visible and exposed over the past year, not least because of Russian imperialism and colonialism of invasion of Ukraine, which is part of a much longer history of colonialism that has to do with empires in and around Europe as well. including also these questions of racialization of different aspects of so-called whiteness as well that pertains to Europe as such in multiple complex ways. And even if I was saying that, okay, this broader question about decolonizing won't be only that we need to write new media histories that take into account others. I have huge respect for the sort of variantology that Siegfried Zielinski did in collaboration with scholars from China to Middle East to Latin America, and the book series that was in search of this idea of variation from and looking at very different histories and ways of methods of understanding of media and art and science as such. So I still find a massive value in Zielinski's work of variantology in those terms. Now, if traveling becomes, and I won't take too long anymore, I'm just gearing towards the end gradually. Now, if traveling then becomes part of a political history of trajectories, our task becomes more interesting than just any cozy interdisciplinarity. Indeed, how does media archaeology respond to many of the recent years of big questions, such as intensification of technologies of automation, such as different AI platforms for text and image production, as these AI platforms can be historically articulated in connection to the early 20th century experimental modes of expression, including automatic writing, statistical experiments with language, and other forms of decentering the subject. In other words, AI was already there in many of those experiments and the mathematical basis of those experiments. Or what is media archaeology when it's faced with a radically different scale of mediation that is not only about something that is at hand in the Heideggerian sense, or something that is graspable as media, whether it's a smartphone or something else, but it's about cloud infrastructures, about big data, and these massive scales between measurement data and power. Some of this work has already been done, or at least underway, not least in reading histories of data through massive apparatuses of colonialism in those terms, of linking digital data to questions of colonial infrastructures, as well as histories of logistics and such. What might next be on the agenda is to ask at what scale can media archaeology remain effective? At what scale does it relate to the planetary transformation underway, with questions of remote sensing and data infrastructures as one key example of or emblematic of? Part of this would have to refocus surely on the history of mathematics, such as probability calculus, at least since the 17th century, and statistical methods and techniques, at least since the 19th century, and other similar modes of mediation by way of numbers, counting, algebra, perhaps the geopolitical history of algebra in the Middle East, as well as at the back of these devices that rescale our notion of media and data storage that happens by way of notation systems and a capacity to deal with abstractions that seems to go into very different framework than media archaeology as it was inherited from some other fields like film studies. And then, furthermore, as my favorite topic, how about the environment? How about the environment, as in the massive scale of climate transformation and its relation to questions of mediation, knowledge, power, and other topics that are not removed from media studies, even if media archaeology has often had a bit, not enough to say about those. Although we have great examples of what environmental media archaeology could be. Nadia Bozak on the fossil fuel basis of early film, returning the question of light and capture of light to this political ecology of fossil fuels as well. Questions of temperature and mediation, as for example, not Marshall McLuhan of Hot and Cold, but Nicole Starosielski, who's been actively pursuing in her hot and cold media research these different questions of literal temperatures, but also the ways in which symbolically they reframe our understanding of this atmosphere of mediation, from thermal cameras to also literal rising temperatures, I would say. To also media archaeologies of planetary materiality. My own work perhaps contributes a bit to this as well, through geology of media as well. These media archaeologies of planetary materiality down to their earthly core, not least such cases as are central to Chile and the surrounding regions, as relating to mining, like lithium, of course. Now more focused on the conditions of green transition, but as significantly involving many layers of what Martin Arboleda has coined the planetary mine. And the same could be asked also about energy. What would be a media archaeological response to energy? A topic that is much better covered by colleagues in histories of science and other related cultural histories, and of course the whole field of energy humanities. And then many other examples of the environmental media to media archaeology nexus, including this intersection of weather, media, and data, including the scientific and operational maps like weather maps as particular media of, let's say, if modern meteorological maps are about 150 years old, at least that 150 years of particular visual vector data of weather maps and their respective infrastructures of communication. My interest in this related, I'm very interested in this area because I'm also needing to write next something on media art histories of environmental data. In other words, these models of sensing and storage of data come to be discussed by way of artistic and design methods. So if, and I'm gearing towards the end, if media archaeology was born, perhaps not resolved, out of a crisis of temporality, representation, and so forth, as Thomas Elsässer has so elegantly shown, that it's a symptom of the crisis of temporality and representation and visual technologies. I wonder what other crises than the climate is the one that is essential for our work as well. Here, to emphasize, media archaeology shouldn't be pitched as some sort of a universal solution. There are likely so many other directions that are much more suited to make sense of this topic of climate and environment. So we should also avoid the sort of template of what does media archaeology have to say about X, with X marking any topic. And yet, in this specific case, environmental, energy, climate, all of these are the inescapable horizon for also humanity's knowledge and the methods and practices we use in our work. It can amount both to an investigation of how the nexus of colonialism and modernity, that as Boltemignolo and others have reminded, functions at the back of modern forms of knowledge and power, is also linked to the trio of colonialism, modernity, and climate crisis, of all of those going together. This trio is also about questions of materiality, about environmental weight, but also epistemic processes of knowledge that media is central to, that we make sense of this crisis through media and have done so. And media archaeologies of, for instance, climate sciences would tell the same, and something that I try to do in my concept of media natures. Then it also has to do with questions of temporality, as in deep times, that we need to understand long-term perspectives of temporality, but not the ones that are echoed in the problematic long-termism of some of the current think tanks and transhumanists. That is something else. And then thirdly, undoing. In other words, what sort of practices and spaces function as infrastructure of the humanities, including media archaeology, in the context of our environmental and climate crisis and the sorts of knowledge that we need around now in 2023 and the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We might have some time for questions, and we can also, as I said, do that in Spanish, and then we'll do translations and so forth. Any language is possible.
Sí. Rubén está por ahí, ¿no? Sí, está por ahí Rubén para las preguntas ahora.
Sí. No puedo activar mi cámara. No me deja. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Parikka. We enjoyed very much your presentation.
Thank you.
I think that those who couldn't understand you in English could follow your presentation in Spanish. So I hope we get some questions. So we have here one question in Zoom. Let me check in YouTube.
Yes.
Well, we don't have any questions yet, so let me talk in Spanish a little bit so I can invite our people
Absolutely.
here to ask some questions. Bien, ahora ha llegado el momento de hacer las preguntas. Pueden hacerlas o bien a través de Zoom o bien a través de YouTube. Yo estoy aquí pendiente de ambos chats para poder recibir sus preguntas y tratar de traducirlas lo mejor posible. Tenemos una primera pregunta con la cual vamos a empezar y si después llegan más preguntas, pues lo haremos así. Carlos has a question here in Zoom, and he's asking, what are the projects that in this Center of Research in Digital Aesthetics that you are leading are being carried on, conducted during these days? And how are you approaching the complexity of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you so much. I'll try to link it a bit to media archaeology, but I also appreciate the fact that it's not just about media archaeology, and I just put in the link into the chat. If I briefly answer, and I'll let you, if you want to, then translate. So I'm leading a Center of Digital Aesthetics that has been going on for 20 years. I've been the director only for a couple of months. And I think the question can be answered in two ways, through our center, but also the broader field of digital aesthetics. Firstly, a lot of what we understand by digital aesthetics for a longer term was basically what software, platforms, AI have been doing in relation to reformatting the question of aesthetics from traditional art theory of aesthetics to the question of how also art practices are changing and modes of knowledge production. So it's a very expanded notion of aesthetics as well. AI is really interesting here because at the moment, and in a media archaeological spirit, I would say that a lot of the interesting questions about AI do not happen on the interface, even if a lot of our cultural discourse is about text and images, and we look at Midjourney images and we look at ChatGPT texts, but actually the question is placed in relation to those questions of training data sets, infrastructures of AI, including environmental cost of those infrastructures of training AI. So I'm almost more interested in this question, like in that translation, the Chilean translation of the book, there was the wonderful imagery from Ladan Joller and Kate Crawford, the idea that AI is a planetary scale factory, that is a planetary scale, massive scale mobilization of energy, materials, labor, and politics. Shall we do a break here? You're muted.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Jussi, yes. Bueno, lo que está diciendo Jussi es que su trabajo en cuanto a la estética digital es algo que va más allá de lo que tradicionalmente entendido por eso, como era pues el software, plataformas, etcétera, y ahora también se están centrando en cómo estas cosas están cambiando nuestras prácticas, nuestras formas de vivir. Entonces están trabajando con una noción de estética más amplia, de lo que habitualmente se entiende por estética. Y en cuanto a la inteligencia artificial, él considera que esto es algo muy, muy importante y hay que tener en cuenta que en cuanto a la inteligencia artificial hay muchas cosas que no pasan delante de nuestros ojos, es decir, que nosotros no las vemos a simple vista. Hay cuestiones interesantes e importantes que son, entiendo, las que le interesan a Jussi, que son, por ejemplo, bueno, cómo se entrenan, ¿no?, estas inteligencias artificiales, qué datos se usan, de dónde vienen, etcétera. Y también, bueno, qué costos ambientales tiene esta producción de esta inteligencia artificial.
Exactly, I'll put the link there as well.
Ahí,
So, oh, sorry,
aquí he
go ahead.
puesto unos links en el chat de Zoom para que puedan conocer un poco más el trabajo. Y voy a compartir también estos links en YouTube para que también los puedan ver.
So this also then relates to the question of practice, right? A lot of critical practice in software art and related fields, where exactly this sort of hacktivist practices with programming and with code, and that has been central part of what we do as well and what we teach as well. But now the really interesting question is, at what scale do we find practices of resistance, practices that are critical, practices that have to somehow tap into these planetary scale systems? And sort of still make sense of this sort of a circulation of data that is not anymore accessible on the level of code or interface, and so this is a really interesting methodological question as well. And besides this, I could talk longer about my new book, Operational Images, because part of that has to do with scales of visuality, but also what is not visual anymore in visual culture. But I'll leave that to a bit for later.
Okay, so, bueno, lo que estaba diciendo aquí Jussi Parikka es que le interesa ahora también buscar, en cuanto a esto de la inteligencia artificial, pues abordar preguntas como dónde encontramos prácticas de resistencia, ¿no?, de resistencia a esta explotación medioambiental, humana, etcétera. Prácticas que resistan este sistema de minería planetaria. También él podría hablar un poco más sobre su trabajo sobre imágenes operacionales, donde él se interesa por la siguiente pregunta: ¿qué es aquello que en una sociedad como la nuestra, donde todo es visible, ¿no?, una sociedad visual, qué es aquello que ya no es visible o que está invisible, ¿no? Eso también es algo que le interesa a Jussi.
Yeah.
Bueno, sí. Did you want to say something else?
No. Let's go to second question, if there is any.
Yes. There's here in Zoom a question that comes from YouTube as well, and I think you can read it by yourself. You see. So the question says, thank you very much. What is your opinion about the works of Mark Fisher, specifically about his statements on the attitude towards nostalgia? Así, la pregunta que hace Cristóbal Koch es cuál es la opinión de Jussi sobre el trabajo de Mark Fisher, específicamente sobre sus afirmaciones en cuanto a la actitud hacia la nostalgia.
That's a great question. I mean, it's a nice question because it's also so open-ended. By the way, for some reason, I don't see the questions on Zoom chat, but anyway, I'll answer this. Yes, Mark Fisher's take on nostalgia and the ways in which particular mechanisms of nostalgia are operative in the cultural politics of capitalism is really something that is central to thinking about thinking and helping media archaeology to understand also the problems with retro. In other words, like Fisher points out, and in much more elegant ways that I'm able to answer now, the idea that nostalgia is this sort of a weird sticking in a particular period that also is preventive of alternative futures to emerge, and the ways in which it becomes integrated into this political circuit of capitalism is really crucial. And it relates to a point that I find super interesting. In other words, how good is media archaeology in reflecting its own relation to, indeed, the cultural context of which it is born? So since 1980s, it's a period of roughly when media archaeology has been discussed. It's also a particular period of consumer capitalism and particular mechanisms that Fisher is talking about, including in popular culture. And part of the arsenal of media archaeology should be indeed this ability to reflect its own relation to the context of which it is born. And this is where the point about Thomas Elsässer, that media archaeology is a symptom and not necessarily always a good solution, is very, very interesting, in the sense that it is a symptom of this particular moment at which nostalgia starts to become a logic, almost like a logic of postmodernism, but not with Mark Fisher now, not with Frederick Jameson. Logic of this sort of like a cutting and basically like managing through temporalities. And that's why the big task has been, of course, as well, of how to invent other temporalities than nostalgia, how to work with historical material that do not fall back to nostalgia or retro or vintage, in those kind of like a bit narrow terms at least, and how to think about the weird sort of conjunctions between alternative pasts and alternative futures. Hopefully this, I'm so sorry, Ruben, that you have to translate. This is so not an easy task. You're muted still, Ruben. Ruben, you're still muted.
Thank you, Jussi. It's not easy indeed, and no. Take notes so I can try to present a translation or something like that. Lo que he podido entender yo de lo que ha dicho Jussi, lo que he podido notar a esta pregunta que hacía Cristóbal Koch, recordemos, ¿no? ¿Cuál es la opinión de Jussi sobre el trabajo de Mark Fisher, especialmente sobre lo que él afirma en cuanto a la actitud que tenemos hacia la nostalgia? Entonces, Jussi considera que es una gran pregunta y dice Jussi que Mark Fisher, o sea, cómo Mark Fisher aborda la nostalgia y en particular el mecanismo de cómo el mecanismo de la nostalgia es operativo en el capitalismo es algo central para entender el trabajo de la arqueología de los medios. La nostalgia, la nostalgia se entiende, ¿no?, como quedar pegado en una parte del tiempo, ¿verdad?, de la temporalidad, ¿sí?, de tal manera que nos previene o nos impide o nos dificulta imaginar un futuro alternativo. Entonces, entiendo que Jussi nos dice que parte del arsenal arsenal teórico, entiendo, de la arqueología de medios, tendría que ser reflexionar sobre el contexto en el cual dicha arqueología fue creada o nació, ¿no? Porque, como ha recordado de nuevo, como ha dicho en la charla, la arqueología mediática de medios, perdón, es un síntoma y no una solución. Entonces, el gran trabajo aquí es cómo inventar nuevas temporalidades que no nos hagan caer en la nostalgia, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo conseguimos pasados alternativos y futuros alternativos? Bueno, esto es lo que he podido hacer buenamente. Aquí tengo más preguntas. So I'm gonna read another question.
Yes.
Alejandro Arros asks, is there any space dedicated to visual communication beyond art history? I'm going to ask the question in Spanish. ¿Hay algún espacio dedicado a la comunicación visual más allá de la historia del arte?
Yeah, it's a good question as well, and sort of it's very close to my heart as well. Especially, I'm now employed in the Department of Digital Design. It's not a it's not a design department in the typical sense, but I'm also interested in the same question that you asked of what are the particular histories of visual design or visual communication in those terms. I think that there very much is, and it relates to many things. And again, this is a slightly Eurocentric answer that I'm going to give, but also perhaps it helps. Centrality of 20th century art and science practices and cross-disciplinary practices are one example where this is happening as well, at least in my own view, my own eyes, whether from Bauhaus onwards to the sorts of intersections of art, science, and technology in post-Bauhaus North American context. So my good colleague and friend Ryan Bishop has collaborated in a book on Technocrats of the Imagination, which is partly about art and science in the Cold War period in the North Americas, but it also has that awareness of that there is a history of particular industrial design or visual communication that goes back to Bauhaus. So that would be obviously one example. And I would say that exactly these forms of industrial design and hence also industrialization of particular visual communication are really interesting as part of this broader spectrum where, let's put it like this, that if media archaeology is the significant part interested in art, science, and technology, that art bit has to include also visual design in multiple kinds of ways as well, whether it's graphic design or whether it's the forms of design that emerge at the back of transformation of graphic design as well. I've got one more thing that I want to add, but let's translate first.
Ok, bueno, voy a intentar, la verdad es que no estoy muy contento con lo que estoy pudiendo hacer en este caso. Bueno, él dice que sí que habría un espacio más allá de la historia del arte y se relaciona con muchas cosas. La respuesta que dice que da Jussi en este caso ahora mismo es una respuesta un tanto eurocéntrica y pide disculpas por eso. Él cree que una de las claves hay que buscarla en la Bauhaus, en esas intersecciones entre ciencia y tecnología también post-Bauhaus. Y bueno, en ese sentido también buscar en las formas de diseño industrial, ¿no? Es allí donde quizá podemos verlo. Él dice que la arqueología de los medios se interesa por la ciencia, la tecnología, la industria, el diseño gráfico. Más o menos va por ahí y pido disculpas por no haber podido dar una mejor traducción más completa. Es complicado traducir tanto y tomar nota. Jussi, please go ahead and say something else. I think you wanted to say something else about this.
Yeah, very briefly, because it's not my expertise, but I'm also thinking that, especially when I ended up with the point about looking at, for instance, experimental graphic design of 20th century as an example of very specific historical media archaeological interest, and where also media archaeology intersects with the question of writing, but writing understood through typography, fonts, design, and such becomes really a way of understanding the material basis of visual communication. And of course, these are very simple examples, and I'm sure the person asking would have much better examples already. But I'm also like, I hope I'm sending the right link, because a friend and colleague, Alessandro Ludovico's work on post-digital is really interesting in this visual communication sense. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's translated into Spanish as well. Originally in English, but Alessandro is a colleague from UK. Ludovico's notion of post-digital print is exactly of looking at what's happened to questions of visual communication and print technologies and such as extension of graphic design, but also looking at transformation after digital culture. And this, I think that it's in a spirit very similar to media archaeology, the notion of post-digitality, especially how Alessandro is using it. So I'm sort of pointing to this work as really interesting insight to this sort of a histories of visual communication that are not just histories, but these interesting back and forth movements that media archaeology is interested in.
Okay, voy a tratar de decir, es decir, de traducir. Bueno, aquí el diseño gráfico experimental es un ejemplo de la arqueología de medios, y donde esta arqueología de medios también se intersecta o intersecciona con la escritura y nos ayuda a entender la base material de la comunicación mediada. Ludovico, me parece que se ha referido a Alejandro Ludovico, me parece que ese era el nombre. Está interesado en la cultura visual postdigital, está interesado en lo que se imprime, ¿verdad? En la imprenta, la impresión, como una extensión del diseño gráfico, y cómo esta impresión, esta imprenta, lo que se llama la cultura impresa, sí, se ha transformado después de la digitalización. Esto se podría tomar, el trabajo de este señor se podría tomar como un ejemplo de esta historia visual de la comunicación. Let me see if I find another question here. I am looking only at Zoom now. Vale, okay, there's a question here from Mauro Salazar, our student from who I heard your name for the first time, Jussi. And let me try to translate on the fly. He writes this in Spanish. So Mauro is saying, since I've been reading your work, that is very much innovative in different times, your work and the fingerprints of Kittler and other authors related to this mediatic materialism. So in the geological epoch, is it mediatic materialism more penetrating at the beginning of the 21st century? I don't know if that made sense. I can try again.
No, that's good. That's good. Exactly. Like probably about the importance. Yes and no. I think that, for instance, my interest in the media materials of geology, but also energy, for instance, and materiality in general, is premised by the ways in which we started understanding that digital culture itself has this extreme weight that is about dependency with fossil fuels, dependency on all kinds of supply chains. And again, here, not just media technologies, but also any kind of green transition, as mentioned, is dependent on lithium, and we know about that a lot in your context, especially. But this prism that has to be with digital culture and its materials has then also opened up the question, of course, of the whole 20th century of industrial media technologies, including whether it's cinema and its dependency on fossil fuels or many other forms of material dependencies. They have come to the light now as well. And the questions we're asking about history are really questions that are triggered by our now awareness of fossil fuels, or let's say the centrality of fossil fuels to every possible industry we can imagine of across 20th century in ways that has necessitated asking new questions from history as well. And I think that that's the reason why we go back and forth between looking at different forms of material footprints of media technologies of, let's say, early 20th century, and then the sort of a material footprints of 21st century. And now the question would become really interesting. If media archaeology is basically looking at the past to invent new futures, what sort of a past would be helpful for us to understand the ways forward with green transition as well, and all kinds of social, aesthetic, and political questions about green transition? Is there a helpful way that media archaeology can look at the past in those terms? some would say that this would be, for instance, about imaginaries of renewable energies that were part of already the 19th century solar punk, and this sort of a different energy sources, perhaps. But I'm leaving there the answer, even if the question was really interesting, and this is only a fragment of a good answer.
Ok, thank you. Mauro, la respuesta más o menos sería la siguiente en español. La respuesta sería sí y no. Mi interés por la materialidad, lo que dice Jussi, ¿verdad?, está fundamentada por cómo empezamos a entender la cultura digital, los medios digitales. Pero la cuestión sobre lo digital, ¿no?, la visualidad digital y el materialismo, la materialidad, ha abierto la pregunta por la materialidad de otros medios de comunicación como el cine. ¿Sí? Que también vemos que el cine pues, depende mucho de los combustibles fósiles. Las preguntas que hacemos en la arqueología de medios están motivadas por el consumo de combustibles fósiles. Entonces, una de las preguntas que se hace en la arqueología de medios es la siguiente. Si la arqueología de medios está mirando al pasado para inventar nuevos futuros, ¿qué tipo de pasado es necesario para inventar un mundo futuro post-petróleo, ¿no? Ya, ya pasado sin este consumo de combustibles fósiles? Entonces, quizá hay que buscar pasados como que han tenido otros tipos de energía, y él citaba algo en el siglo XIX, pero ahí me he perdido, no lo he entendido del todo.
Can I add one thing? I'll add really briefly one thing as well, that obviously this question that Mauro asked was really, it really hits the center of what I'm interested in now as well, even if we don't necessarily call it media archaeology. But in a forthcoming book and a long-term collaboration with Abelardo Gil Fournier from Madrid, we've finished a book and it's coming out next year called Living Surfaces, and where we take this question of scales of materiality of planetary media and environmental media, and we also start looking at these different media archaeological histories since early 19th century as well. So we do one sort of a media history, media archaeology, history of science, something like that, of exactly these questions of media materiality, but with the focus on the question of the surface, but also especially environmental surfaces. So there's, just as a placeholder, I wanted to mention, and also again mention Abelardo's wonderful work.
Bueno, yo sí quería añadir algo más, y bueno, la pregunta que hace Mauro da en el centro de lo que le interesa, y bueno, ha hablado de un último libro que en inglés parece que se llama Living Surfaces, que yo traduciría así a lo rápido al español como superficies vivas, y en este libro entiendo que miran a la arqueología de medios desde principios del siglo XIX, y justamente tienen mucho interés o se fijan mucho en el medio ambiente de ese tiempo, ¿no? Es decir, en el planeta, etc. Entiendo que va por ahí. Te pido disculpas, Mauro, no hacerlo mejor. Okay, let me see if I find another question here. Okay. Okay, there's another question by Claudia Riquelme. Thank you, Claudia, for your question. And she writes in English, so I thank her as well for that. And she says the following, but where is digital creativity and its registration? The Bauhaus was almost 100 years ago. Where is the new Bauhaus that happens in all kinds of things, especially in relation to digital?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right as well. That I should have been very cautious with mention of Bauhaus. It's like, do we really need to go back to the same examples? But it was only in the context of the visual communication that I wanted to bring it up. I totally agree that it's somewhere else than just or even in the kind of idea that what is the new Bauhaus. There's much more interesting. Or let's say there's much more current and much more contemporary examples. I don't even know how to start answering, because we're in such a different kind of a situation on a planetary scale as well. And first is that we wouldn't be looking at a particular European model of education in those terms. We would need to look at it from a much vaster international perspective, and we would need to look at it from the perspectives of responses to environmental crisis, but also the political crisis at the back of environmental crisis. So there's a lot of political and policy at the moment going on. I think it was recently as well that there was a European Union had some funding call that for the new Bauhaus and the Green New Deal. So it's very much in the right direction, but it's also like and there was a very heated debate of why this is such a old-fashioned model to even think about. So I guess that I'm not able to answer this of where they exactly are, but I'm interested in all kinds of, let's say, multiple scales of organization, that some of them happen at the universities, but some of them happen also outside universities in activist organizations, all kinds of laboratories and transdisciplinary, but also politically very progressive ways of combining thinking about futures from perspectives of queer, decolonial, feminist futures as such as well. And I probably would say that if we want to even use the B word of Bauhaus, it would need to be exactly a radically decolonial, queer, feminist sort of a Bauhaus, but not even using the word B there, Bauhaus. This is a very, very poor answer to a really great question.
Bien, voy a empezar por el final porque me ayuda mucho, y es que Jussi dice que la respuesta que ha dado es un poco pobre para una pregunta muy buena que ha hecho. Sí, así que imagínense después de mi traducción cómo va a quedar esa respuesta. Dice que Claudia tiene mucha razón, pues hay que tener cuidado con mencionar a la Bauhaus. Hay muchos ejemplos recientes, pero no sé dónde empezar. Estamos en una situación muy distinta a escala planetaria. Tenemos que verlo desde la perspectiva de las crisis climáticas y políticas. La Unión Europea ha abierto un concurso para hacer una nueva Bauhaus, un nuevo Green Deal, acuerdo verde, ¿verdad? Acuerdo político. Y hay, bueno, pues quizá en lugar de hablar de Bauhaus, podemos hablar de laboratorios, de universidades, de futuros decoloniales, feminismos, queer, etc. Pero bueno, que es difícil dar respuesta a esta pregunta tan buena de Claudia.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia.
Gracias, Claudia. Y bueno, Claudia thanks you as well. And I don't see any other question here in Zoom. Let me go to YouTube and see.
We can see if there's a final question.
Yes. Okay. No. Cristobal Koch in YouTube was very thankful for your answer, Dr. Parikka. So
thank you.
This is all from YouTube at this point.
Great, thank you. Thank you as well. The questions have been really, really great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I would like to tell you as well, Dr. Parikka, I would like to kindly ask you to remain here with us once we finish this event. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I will give the word to Carlos so he can, dismiss us. Carlos, por favor.
Para cerrar ya, dices tú, ¿sí? Ya no hay más consultas. Bueno, agradecer la presentación del doctor Parikka. Creo que ha sido un aporte interesante, importante para nuestro programa de doctorado en comunicación, donde nos planteamos estas preguntas, además de otras que él nos ha activado, y creo que va a ser muy interesante poder seguir trabajando en esta perspectiva que nos viene interesando hace algún tiempo más. Así que muchas gracias, doctor Parikka, muchas gracias a las y los estudiantes, investigadoras que se han sumado a esta actividad, tanto a través del Zoom como del canal de YouTube. Así es que reitero mis agradecimientos.
Thank you very much, Dr. Parikka, for being with us, and thank you to all the students that were here with us.
Thank you.